Hey, welcome back to the Reconstruction era, historians. In our last lesson, we learned about Andrew Johnson's derailment of the Reconstruction process based on his white supremacist beliefs. Johnson's rivalry with Congress led him not to run for a second term, and the Democratic nominee to replace Johnson lost the election. Do you think Johnson's Republican successor held similar views on race? Let's hear his words.
The condition of the colored man within our borders may become a source of anxiety, to say the least. But he was brought to our shores by compulsion, and he now should be considered as having as good a right to remain here as any other class of our citizens.
In the wake of Johnson's impeachment, Americans chose war hero and fervent Reconstruction supporter Ulysses S. Grant to be their president. Grant was dedicated to passing policies ensuring fair treatment and civil rights for black men and women. Now, do you think he can get things back on track? Today, we'll explore Reconstruction under Grant. Your learning objectives are to identify the achievements of Reconstruction governments in southern states, describe resistance to Reconstruction, and analyze key policies of the Grant administration. You may remember that Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, which authorized the use of the Army to enforce Reconstruction policies in the South. Now, the Army made a big difference almost immediately. For example, in the election of 1868, as many as 500,000 black voters turned out to the polls for the first time. In the election of 1868, the vote was much closer than expected. Hundreds of thousands of black voters played a big part in helping President Grant secure a victory. But black voters were even more impactful in southern state and local elections. For the first time, black politicians were elected to office at all levels, including Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. The first black U.S. senators, black churches became powerful political forces and remain so to this day. Black voting groups held their own conventions to choose black candidates to support. In all, 20 black U.S. representatives and 2 black senators were elected to Congress between 1869 and 1901. At the state level, Southern Reconstruction governments invested in schools, rebuilt damaged roads and railroads, and promoted land ownership for black citizens. This reversed black codes enacted by Southern Democrats during the Johnson era, which had restricted the rights and freedoms of black citizens, including the right to own land. Finally, it seemed the work of Reconstruction was back on track, literally, since the trains were running again. But change is never easy. There were lots of people who didn't want reform. Reconstruction governments did what they could to build a harmonious and peaceful multiracial society. However, some white people interpreted progress toward political and social equality as if power had been taken away from them, rather than extended to more people, and they strongly opposed it. The 1860s saw the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, and the Knights of the White Camellia. The KKK undermined Reconstruction and suppressed civil rights for black Americans. They used terror and violence to intimidate black people from voting and running for office. They promoted white rule and white power. Race riots broke out in New Orleans, Memphis, and other southern cities in which black communities were attacked by white supremacists, and buildings like freedmen's schools were burned. Now, the KKK used violence, lynching and beating black people, and shooting into the homes of Republican voters and black families to drive fear into them. And by the mid-1870s, the KKK had suppressed the Republican vote so effectively in some states that Democrats regained control. New state laws were passed by Democrats who opposed Reconstruction that made it even harder for black voters to cast a ballot. One example of such a law was a poll tax. Poll taxes are fees that people had to pay before voting. And because a large portion of black voters were poor, this prevented most of them from setting foot in a voting booth. Another method states used was literacy tests. These tests required a voter to prove they could read before receiving a ballot. Literacy tests targeted black voters in particular because in most southern states, it had been a crime to teach enslaved people to read before the Civil War. In practice, the tests weren't fairly distributed either. In many cases, white election supervisors gave a very easy test to a white voter who might barely be able to read, if at all, while they handed a difficult or impossible test to black voters. And it was clear that their function was to allow white voters to cast ballots and to restrict black voters from doing so. Finally, many state governments enacted grandfather clauses, which allowed voters to bypass barriers like poll taxes and literacy tests if their grandfather could vote. Well, black voters couldn't be grandfathered in because their grandfathers weren't considered citizens. So the effect of these laws was limiting the black vote without suppressing the white vote. The Army could be only so effective. The Military Reconstruction Act authorized the Army to, for example, administer an election, but it did not authorize the Army to determine what the rules of the election were. More needed to be done to ensure the same freedoms for black citizens that white citizens had enjoyed for centuries. And let's see what the Grant administration was able to achieve. Now, Congress passed a number of policies to address voter suppression and violence perpetrated by white supremacist groups. The Enforcement Acts, known to some as the KKK Acts, were a series of laws aimed at combating terror in the South and protecting the rights of emancipated people. In the Colfax Massacre in 1873, a group of white supremacists attacked and killed over 100 black voters, protecting a courthouse in Louisiana, where Republicans, including black elected officials, were being sworn into office. The federal government used the Enforcement Acts to prosecute and convict several of the perpetrators. Congress also passed the 15th Amendment and sent it to the states. This amendment prevented any restriction of the right to vote on the basis of race. It prevented states from trying to set exclusionary rules for voting or trying to nullify federal laws protecting voting rights for black men, marking a major step toward equality. Finally, Congress passed and Grant signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law aimed to provide equal access to publicly accessible places, including trains, bathrooms, theaters, or baseball games. These measures were designed to prevent segregation in society. And whether or not they were successful was a different story, as you'll see in our next lesson. President Grant held office the longest of any president during the Reconstruction era. During his tenure, some huge milestones were achieved, including the election of black Americans to public office for the first time. But it is important to recognize the racism that persisted across the South. For every policy aimed at working toward racial equality, white supremacists worked to ensure that it wasn't enforced effectively, if at all. White supremacists terrorized black people and others who supported Republican lawmakers, thinking that intimidation and violence would suppress voting. In the long term, their actions allowed Democrats to reclaim control of state governments across the South and implement policies that shut black citizens out of the political process. When President Grant left office, it was 1877, 12 years after the 13th Amendment ordered the emancipation of all people. Now, how long would it take for them to enjoy the freedoms they were promised? In our next lesson, we'll take a look at how the Reconstruction era drew to a close 3 full presidential terms after the end of the Civil War. Until then, historians, remember, shaping the future begins with understanding the past. Hey, hey.